Chapter 3. The First Resurrection. Connor's feet hit the pavement in their usual rhythm. The October morning crisp enough to make his breath visible in small clouds. His morning jog followed the same route every day, down Maple Street, left on Riverside, a loop past the old mill, then back through the residential streets, where houses grew progressively larger and more Victorian. It was 8:07 a.m. when he passed Eleanor Henderson's house. The same moment, he passed it every morning, his internal clock calibrated by 4 centuries of precise routine. The fogged bathroom window caught his eye first. Connor slowed to a walk, then stopped completely. The morning was cool, yes, but not cold enough to justify that much condensation on glass. And Eleanor's windows were usually clear by this hour. She rose at 6, opened windows to let in fresh air, complained about stuffy houses and modern people who sealed themselves in like canned goods. The fogged window was wrong. Then he noticed the newspaper, still rolled in its plastic sleeve on the front porch. Eleanor read the paper with her coffee every morning, had done so for 40 years. She'd told him once that the day she stopped reading the morning paper was the day they could carry her out, feet first. Then the silence. Absolute, complete silence from a house that was usually alive with NPR and the sounds of breakfast preparation by this hour. Eleanor's routines were as rigid as his own. Tea kettle whistling at 6:15. Radio on at 6:30. Dishes clattering by 7. Connor's centuries of experience with death had given him an instinct others lacked. The air around Eleanor's house felt different, still in a way that had nothing to do with weather or wind. Death had a particular quality to it, a heaviness that settled into spaces and made them feel abandoned, even when furniture and belongings remained. Something was very wrong. He approached the house slowly, his doctor's bag still in his car, but his phone in his hand. "Eleanor?" he called from the front walk. No answer. He climbed the porch steps, knocked firmly on the door. "Eleanor, it's Connor. Just checking in?" Nothing. The silence pressed against his ears. He tried the door handle, locked. Connor moved around the side of the house, past the garden beds Eleanor tended with religious devotion, now brown and ready for winter. The kitchen door, which faced the backyard, was unlocked. Eleanor always locked her doors, always. She'd lived through the 1970s crime wave, even in quiet Millbrook, and had never lost the habit of double-checking locks before bed. Connor pushed the door open slowly. "Eleanor, it's Dr. McMaster's. Your kitchen door was open, and I wanted to make sure everything's okay." The house held the unmistakable quality of death, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. Connor had experienced it thousands of times over his long life, the absence of breath, the cessation of all the tiny sounds a living person makes without realizing. The house wasn't just quiet, it was empty of life. He moved through the kitchen with medical efficiency, noting the clean counters, the dish rack with last night's dinner plate and teacup, the calendar on the wall with yesterday's date circled in red pen, everything in its place, everything normal except for the wrongness that permeated the air like invisible smoke. The living room was equally undisturbed. Eleanor's reading glasses on the side table, a novel bookmarked and waiting, the television remote lined up precisely with the edge of the coffee table. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of forced entry or violence. Connor climbed the stairs, his footsteps loud in the thick silence. He checked the bedroom first, bed made, clothes laid out for today, slippers placed neatly beside the nightstand. Eleanor's nightgown was missing from its usual hook on the bathroom door. He already knew what he would find before he pushed open the bathroom door. Eleanor Henderson lay face down in her bathtub, fully clothed in her flannel nightgown. The water was cold. Connor could see that from the doorway, could see how it had gone completely motionless, undisturbed for hours. Her silver hair floated around her head like seaweed, and her hands were braced against the sides of the tub, fingers slightly curled. Connor knelt beside the bathtub, his fingers automatically reaching for her wrist. No pulse. Her skin was cold and waxy, the texture of flesh that had been submerged for hours. Rigor mortis was beginning to set in. Her jaw was stiff, her fingers resistant when he tried to move them. She'd been dead for at least 6 hours, probably longer. His trained eye took in the scene with clinical precision. No visible head wound, though he'd need to turn her over to check properly. No signs of struggle in the bathroom. The soap was still in its dish. the shampoo bottles undisturbed, the shower curtain hanging neatly on its rod. The tub was nearly full, water level suggesting she'd been submerged while the water was still running. But Eleanor's hands bothered him. They were braced against the tub sides in a way that suggested she'd tried to push herself up. The position was wrong for someone who'd simply slipped and hit her head. If she'd been unconscious, her hands would have been relaxed, floating. These hands showed effort, struggle, the desperate attempt to lift herself from water that was filling her lungs. Connor sat back on his heels, his mind working through possibilities with the methodical precision of someone who'd studied death from every angle for 400 years. Eleanor was 78, yes, but healthy, no heart condition, no history of strokes, no mobility issues beyond mild arthritis. She could have had a sudden cardiac event in the tub, but that wouldn't explain the filled bathtub. Because Eleanor hated bathtubs. She'd told him once during a routine checkup about nearly drowning as a child. She'd been 7, gone under, and couldn't surface. Her mother had pulled her out, but the terror had never left. She avoided swimming, wouldn't go near lakes, and never, ever took baths. She had a walk-in shower installed 5 years ago, specifically to avoid using the tub. Yet, here she was, in a filled bathtub, wearing her nightgown, dead by drowning. Connor's eyes went cold as the truth crystallized in his mind. This was no accident. Someone had filled this tub, held Eleanor Henderson under the water, and staged it to look like an elderly woman's tragic mistake. This was murder. He pulled out his phone, his mind already racing ahead to consequences and possibilities. But first, the performance. Connor took a deep breath, let his hands shake slightly, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Connor McMasters. His voice cracked perfectly, the sound of a man in shock. I'm at 47 Lakeview Drive. I've found my patient, Eleanor Henderson. She's drowned in her bathtub. I think she's been here all night. As he gave details to the dispatcher. Yes, he was certain she was dead, no pulse, cold to the touch, been here for hours. His other hand trailed through the bathwater, almost absently. The wheels were already turning. Chief Maria Rodriguez arrived 12 minutes later with 2 patrol officers and the county coroner. Connor had stayed in the bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet seat with his head in his hands, the picture of a devastated physician who'd lost a patient. Connor. Rodriguez's voice was gentle as she appeared in the doorway. She was a solid woman in her 50s, with steel grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been Millbrook's police chief for 15 years and had worked with Connor on various medical-related cases. She trusted his judgment, respected his professionalism, which was exactly why Connor had cultivated the relationship. He looked up, made his eyes red-rimmed and shocked. Maria, thank God you're here. I can't believe. Tell me what happened. She gestured for him to step into the hallway while the coroner and crime scene photographer entered the bathroom. Connor stood deliberately unsteady and followed her out. I had a house call scheduled with Eleanor for later today, but when I was jogging past this morning around 8, I noticed the fogged window, the newspaper still on the porch. Eleanor's very routine-oriented. She's always up early, always has the paper inside by 7. I got worried. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of distress he'd perfected decades ago. The front door was locked, but the kitchen door was unlocked. That's not like her. She's careful about locks. Rodriguez nodded, making notes. So you entered through the kitchen? I called out first, multiple times. When there was no answer, I came in to check on her. Found her. He gestured toward the bathroom, let his voice trail off. Did you touch anything? I checked for a pulse, but she was cold, already in rigor. She's been dead for hours. Connor met Rodriguez's eyes. Maria, I think she might have had a stroke or a cardiac event. She was 78, and even though she was healthy, these things happen. It was a carefully calculated statement, not a lie, exactly. Those things did happen, but also a gentle steering toward the conclusion he needed the police to reach. Rodriguez studied him for a moment, then nodded. Any chance she fell? Hit her head getting into the tub? Connor hedged carefully. I didn't see any visible head trauma, but I didn't want to move her. The coroner will do a thorough examination. He paused, then added, Eleanor was sharp as a tack, mentally, physically active. I can't imagine what would have caused this, but sometimes the heart just stops. The coroner, a methodical man named Gerald Wright, emerged from the bathroom pulling off latex gloves. No obvious signs of trauma, no visible bruising or defensive wounds. Water temperature suggests she's been here 8 to 10 hours. I'll know more after the autopsy, but preliminary examination is consistent with accidental drowning. Accidental? Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. An elderly woman drowns in her own bathtub at night? Wright shrugged. It happens more often than you'd think. She could have felt dizzy, run a bath to relax, then had a stroke or heart attack while in the water, or simply fell asleep and slipped under. Without signs of forced entry or struggle, there's no reason to suspect foul play. He checked his notes. Based on body temperature and rigor, I'd estimate time of death around 10 p.m. last night. Tuesday evening. Tuesday evening. Connor's mind locked onto that detail. Eleanor's weekly alone evening. Her book club friends met on Tuesdays, and she always stayed home. Anyone watching her routine would know that. Rodriguez sighed, looking back at the bathroom. These old Victorians, those tubs are deep and slippery. Probably shouldn't have been bathing alone at her age. Connor made appropriate sympathetic noises while internally noting every detail. His suspicion solidified. This was planned. Someone knew Eleanor's routine, knew Tuesday was her alone evening, knew exactly when to strike. He needed to give her just enough information to feel thorough without raising red flags. Eleanor was scheduled for a checkup with me next week, he offered quietly. She'd mentioned some dizzy spells recently. I told her it was probably just her blood pressure medication needing adjustment, but he let the implication hang. Maybe he'd missed something. Maybe this was a medical failure rather than a crime. Rodriguez's expression softened. Connor, don't do that to yourself. You're a good doctor. If Eleanor had a medical emergency, there's nothing you could have done to prevent it. Connor nodded, then added almost casually, she did mention something else at her last appointment. A real estate agent who'd been coming by, pressuring her to sell. It seemed to bother her. Rodriguez's attention sharpened slightly. Ian Martin? Yes, I think that was the name. He's been pretty aggressive with several of our elderly residents, hasn't he? Yeah, he has. Rodriguez frowned. You think there's a connection? Connor shook his head quickly. Probably nothing. Just seemed to upset her, that's all. I'm sure it's unrelated. He made his voice uncertain, planting the seed without pushing too hard. Rodriguez made a note in her pad, but didn't pursue it further. The flash went off repeatedly, freezing her final moments in stark white light. The coroner and his assistant worked to carefully remove her from the tub, water sloshing and dripping onto the tile floor. Connor observed it all with practiced sorrow on his face and cold calculation in his mind. The police were doing exactly what he'd expected, treating this as a tragic accident, an elderly woman's unfortunate end. They'd do their due diligence, photograph the scene, write their reports, and conclude that Eleanor Henderson had died alone in her bathtub, possibly from a medical event, possibly from drowning after falling asleep. No one would look for a murderer because everyone would assume there was no murder. But Connor knew better. In his centuries of life, he'd seen enough death to recognize its many faces. He'd seen accidental drownings and deliberate ones. He'd seen bodies positioned to suggest one thing while hiding another. And he'd seen the particular fear in the set of Eleanor's hands, the desperate attempt to push herself up from water that was killing her. Someone had murdered Eleanor Henderson. Someone had filled that bathtub, held her under, and staged it to look like an accident. Someone who knew she lived alone, who knew she was elderly enough that no one would question a sudden death, who knew how to make murder look like natural causes. The question was, who? And, more importantly, why? Connor filed through his mental catalogue of Eleanor's life. She was a retired high school teacher, widowed for 15 years, no children. She had some money. The Victorian house was paid off. And she'd mentioned a pension and investments, but not enough to warrant murder by some distant relative. No known enemies, no dramatic conflicts, just a quiet life of gardening and book clubs and morning newspapers. So, what had gotten her killed? The officers completed their sweep of the house. and reported to Rodriguez. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no disturbances anywhere. Eleanor's purse was on the kitchen counter with her wallet intact, cash and credit cards present. Her jewellery box in the bedroom was undisturbed. Nothing stolen, nothing vandalised. Looks like a straightforward accidental drowning, one of the officers concluded. Rodriguez nodded slowly. All right, let's finish processing the scene and release it to next of kin. Connor, do you know if Eleanor had any family? A nephew in Boston, Connor said. David Henderson. I think I have his contact information in my files. Eleanor listed him as her emergency contact. Would you mind calling him? It might be easier coming from you than from a stranger. Connor nodded, pulling out his phone and stepping into Eleanor's bedroom for privacy. He made the call, delivered the news with appropriate gravity, listened to David's shock and grief. Yes, he'd come to Millbrook within the next few days to handle arrangements. Yes, Connor could recommend a funeral home. When Connor returned to the hallway, the coroner's assistants were manoeuvring Eleanor's body into a black bag. The zipper's sound was loud in the quiet house. Rodriguez was giving final instructions to her officers, wrapping up the scene. We'll do a full autopsy. Wright told Rodriguez. Should have preliminary results by tomorrow afternoon, but I'd be shocked if it's anything other than accidental drowning. 20 minutes later, everyone had left. The police, the coroner, Eleanor's body, all gone. Rodriguez had asked Connor to lock up the house, entrusting him with the spare keys found in Eleanor's kitchen drawer. Connor stood alone in Eleanor's living room, looking at the reading glasses on the side table, the bookmarked novel, the evidence of a life interrupted. His expression had shifted now that he was alone. No more grief, no more shock. His eyes were cold and calculating, his mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Thoughtful, predatory. He'd spent centuries being careful, being cautious, maintaining his cover and his safety. But Eleanor Henderson's murder had given him something he hadn't felt in decades. Genuine interest. A puzzle to solve, a game to play. A murderer who thought he'd gotten away with it. Connor walked slowly through the house one more time, memorising details, planning his next moves. Ian Martin had killed Eleanor for her property, staged it as an accident, and now believed himself safe. He had no idea what was coming. Connor locked the front door behind him and stood on Eleanor's porch in the afternoon sunlight. His expression was distant, already planning, already calculating. He'd found something interesting at last. 3 nights later, Connor entered the county morgue at 2 a.m. He used his own keys, ones he'd legitimately held for 15 years from consulting on medical examiner cases. The building was empty. The night attendant on his scheduled break and the security cameras had a convenient blind spot Connor had identified years ago. He moved through the cold, sterile hallways with absolute confidence until he reached the refrigerated storage. Eleanor's body was in drawer 7B at awaiting cremation per her will. Connor pulled out the drawer and looked at her pale, cold face. For a moment, his expression was genuinely sad. He'd liked Eleanor, and this was a violation of the natural order he'd committed countless times, but never took lightly. He pulled back the sheet and placed both hands on Eleanor's forehead. His eyes closed, and he began whispering in a language that he hadn't been spoken in over 100 years. Old Irish mixed with something older, darker, words that predated Christianity. The air in the morgue grew colder. Connor's breath became visible. A faint, sickly green luminescence emanated from his palms. The incantation continued for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then Eleanor's eyes snapped open. She gasped, trying to scream, but Connor covered her mouth gently. Shh, Eleanor. You're safe. You're with me. Dr. McMasters. I know this is terrifying, but I need you to stay quiet. Eleanor's eyes were wild with panic and confusion. She was freezing, disoriented, remembering water and darkness, and then nothing, and now this. Connor helped her sit up, wrapped her in a blanket he'd brought, and began explaining in his most soothing doctor voice. You died, Eleanor. Tuesday night, someone drowned you in your bathtub. But I brought you back. I have certain abilities. I'm a necromancer, and I've given you a second life. The explanation took 10 minutes, during which Eleanor cycled through denial, terror, anger, and finally a strange, fierce acceptance. When he told her he suspected Ian Martin killed her, her expression hardened. "Prove it," she demanded. Connor smiled, his first genuine smile in years. "Oh, I will, and we're going to make him very, very sorry." Connor's farmhouse sat on 10 acres outside Millbrook proper, a sprawling 2-story structure that had been renovated multiple times over the decades to maintain its appearance while incorporating modern conveniences. The property included a barn, a greenhouse, and 2 smaller outbuildings. Plenty of space for privacy, and, as it turned out, perfect for hiding a resurrected person. He drove Eleanor there in the pre-dawn darkness, taking back roads to avoid the few early risers who might be out. She sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket from the morgue, staring out the window at the passing landscape with an expression Connor couldn't quite read. "This is real," she said finally, more statement than question. "Yes. I'm not having some kind of near-death hallucination. I actually died, and you actually brought me back?" "Yes." Eleanor let out a long breath. "My mother always said I'd live to see interesting times. I don't think this is what she meant." Connor pulled into his driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. The farmhouse's lights were off, except for the porch light he'd left on, programmed to turn on at dusk, off at dawn, part of his careful routine of appearing normal. He led Eleanor through the back entrance and up a staircase to what had once been servants' quarters, but was now a comfortable guest suite. The room was furnished simply but well. A 4-poster bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a reading chair by the window, and an attached bathroom. "I prepared this earlier today," Connor said. "Fresh linens, toiletries, clothes that should fit you. I estimated from your medical records. The door locks from the inside if you want privacy, but you're not a prisoner. You can move freely through the house." Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the dark fields beyond. "You were planning this. Before you even resurrected me, you were planning to bring me here." "I needed to be prepared for multiple scenarios. This seemed the most likely." She turned to face him, and in the dim light from the hallway, her eyes still held that faint green glow. "You said you've done this 43 times. Resurrected people. What happened to the others?" Connor leaned against the doorframe. 31 survived the process. Most went back to their lives after we arranged appropriate cover stories. A few chose to disappear, start over somewhere else with new identities. 2 stayed with me for several years before moving on. And the 12 who didn't survive? The ritual failed. Their souls had already moved on, or the damage to their bodies was too extensive, or they simply didn't want to return. Resurrection requires will on both sides, mine and theirs. Eleanor absorbed this, then nodded slowly. "I'll take that tea now, if the offer still stands." They went downstairs to Connor's kitchen, a large room with modern appliances hiding behind vintage cabinet facades. Connor put the kettle on while Eleanor settled at the kitchen table, running her hands over the smooth wood surface as if testing whether it was real. "Tell me about Ian Martin," she said. Connor pulled 2 mugs from a cabinet. Real mugs, not the delicate china that would suggest a man who lived alone and didn't care about comfort. Ian Martin, 42, real estate agent for Millbrook Properties. Divorced 2 years ago, expensive settlement. He's been trying to assemble several properties along Lakeview Drive for a development project. Your house was the keystone. Without it, the whole deal falls apart. How do you know all this? I pay attention. It's how you survive. You watch, you listen, you remember details that others forget. The kettle whistled, and Connor poured hot water over tea bags. Ian's been drinking more lately. His office has collection notices in the trash. He drives past your house at odd hours. The pattern of a desperate man making terrible decisions. Eleanor accepted the tea, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. You think he killed me for my house? I know he did. The question is how to prove it, and more importantly, what to do about it. We go to the police, Chief Rodriguez, and tell her what? Connor interrupted gently. That you were murdered, but you're fine now because I resurrected you with necromancy. Eleanor, the police ruled your death accidental. Your body is scheduled for cremation tomorrow. Your nephew is planning your funeral for next week. If you suddenly appear alive, there will be questions I cannot answer without exposing what I am. Then what do you suggest? Connor sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. I could go to the police, Connor said, but where's the fun in that? Besides, you're supposed to be dead. Revealing you're alive complicates things. Questions I'd rather not answer about how you survived. Eleanor listened, her principal's brain analysing the situation. You want to use me to torment him, she said flatly. Connor didn't deny it. I want to give him exactly what he deserves, a slow descent into paranoia and madness. And you want justice, don't you? Eleanor considered this. She was a woman who taught high school for 40 years. She believed in rules and proper consequences. But she also remembered drowning, the water filling her lungs, the terror and pain. Finally, she nodded. I want him to pay, but we do this carefully. No more bodies. Connor agreed, though his smile suggested he was already considering scenarios. We toy with him, drive him to confession, but we don't kill him. We let the justice system handle that part. He paused. Though I can't promise I won't enjoy the toying part. I wouldn't expect you to. Eleanor set down her mug. So what's the plan? How do we do this without revealing that I'm alive? We'll need to be creative. Start small, things that could be coincidence, but will make him uneasy. A light left on in your house. Your car moved slightly in the driveway. Small signs that something isn't quite right. Then we escalate gradually. Let his imagination do most of the work. And meanwhile, I hide here. For how long? Until we have what we need. A confession, evidence, something that will hold up in court. It could be days, could be weeks. Connor met her eyes. I know it's not ideal. Ideal would be not being murdered in the first place, Eleanor interrupted dryly. But given the circumstances, I've had worse accommodations. At least this guest room isn't a morgue drawer. Connor laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. Fair point. They spent the rest of the night establishing ground rules. Eleanor would stay hidden at the farmhouse until Connor determined the next move. She couldn't contact family or friends yet. Too many questions. Connor would provide everything she needed, and in exchange, she'd follow his instructions for when and how to make her presence known. As dawn broke, Eleanor looked out at the autumn landscape through the kitchen window and realised she'd been given an impossible gift, a second life and a chance for revenge. Connor watched her and realised with surprise that he was actually enjoying having company. 400 years of solitude had left him starved for connection, even if this connection began with murder and necromancy. He smiled to himself, sipping his tea, and began to plan.